In the spring of 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte was a defeated man. He had raised and lost two armies, around 1,000,000 men in total, over the previous 2 years. He had been forced to retreat from Russia into Germany and finally into France itself. On March 31st, Paris opened its gates to the armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, while in the south the British had crossed into France from the Iberian Peninsula. Whatever glimmer of hope Napoleon had was extinguished when his own marshals, the men who had conquered Europe with him, came to inform him that the army would no longer fight to defend his crown. Having exhausted all of her options, Napoleon offered his unconditional abdication on the 6th of April. Finally, unable to bear the loss of his empire, his crown, and his legacy, Napoleon drank the vial of poison he had kept with him since the Russian campaign. As he lay in bed, convulsing, delirious, few, not least Napoleon himself, could have predicted that just a year again he would be leading France and its armies into war. And few still could predict it would end even more disastrously, because this is no one is competent. Welcome, beautiful people of the internet, to the podcast that refuses to die. Happy 2025, everybody, or at least surviving 2025, everybody. This is our motto this year, Jay. Refusing to die. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's been a little while, but I'm glad to get back to this.
I am as well. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to the No One Is Competent podcast, the number one show on the internet trying to convince you that everyone who's ever been in charge in history is worse at their jobs than you are at yours. You've already heard from my wonderful co-host, Jaharis. I am Azalea. You can find us on Twitter because I'm probably like 4 months away from going to Blue Sky, but it's just so fucking annoying to switch. All right, anyway, on Twitter, at Azalea Wyatt and at Jaharis48. Let's get the plugs out before I start rambling. Plugs. Our music is done by the brilliant and legendary Sam Bryce. You can email us at noitiscompetent@gmail.com if you want to, give us some podcast recommendations or episode recommendations or say hi or say bye or, just do whatever. I do check that feed on the reg. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit us with a subscribe. If you are on Apple, please rate us in the podcast app. We greatly appreciate that, especially because this show is coming at you with no advertisers, no sponsors, and no reason to exist other than the sheer autism of its co-hosts. Alright, because it's been on so long, I don't want to belabor the intro other than to say that I hope everyone's having a good 2025, and I am once again violently thankful that this is not a breaking news podcast.
You can always pivot towards current affairs.
We could always pivot towards current affairs if you're the one editing this bitch.
I think I'll pass.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
History's more interesting anyways. There's nothing really going on nowadays.
What is history but slightly less recent events?
Yeah, exactly.
Also, we have an upcoming episode planned for something that's not super long ago. So welcome to, and we've got a $1,500 word here, penultimate episode on the No One Is Competent French Revolution series. What are we talking about today, Jay? What is it called?
And we're talking, of course, about the famous 100 Days. That is to say, Napoleon's return from exile in Elba.
Not 98 days, not 99, just 100.
Yeah, give or take.
No, it was exactly 100 days.
Sure.
I do not care about any evidence to the contrary.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume it was exactly 2,400 hours.
Maybe.
Wait. Yes. Damn, I'm cooked. So just to remind y'all, we've covered the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, and the various wars of the coalition, which, after the sixth time being the charm, the coalition finally won. So today we're going to discuss how their big plan to make sure that Napoleon would never be a threat to the balance of power in Europe again completely fractured within a matter of months. And next time, we will conclude the series with the great climax of Waterloo, and we will try to determine whether or not any of this shit actually means anything. How does that sound, Jay? Good plan?
Sounds like a plan, yes.
And this is the part that's, like, always cut out. Like, I mean, there's whole movies that have been made about Waterloo, but, like, the way I was taught in school was yada yada, there was the revolution, yada yada, there was Napoleon, and then, like, the whole, like, him coming back is sort of like a fun fact footnote. I think it's treated in most history classes. Like, it's never explained to me, like, how did he get out?
Somehow Napoleon Bonaparte has returned.
Somehow Napoleon. I mean, maybe that's why they skipped it. Maybe they just thought that episode 9 was bad, and they just chose not to acknowledge its existence. Very understandable. So what are our sources for this episode?
Our sources are 100 Days, Napoleon's Road to Waterloo by Alan Sham, The Napoleonic Wars by Gregory Fremont Barnes and Todd Fisher, Waterloo 1815 by Geoffrey Wooten, and Waterloo the Campaign of 1815 by John Hussey.
So, a reminder from the top. On April the 6th, Napoleon abdicates. A few days later, he swallows this vial of poison that he's had on him for a while. You know, this kind of makes sense considering how much of a nerd he was for Rome and all of those guys. It just definitely feels like how a Roman general would go out. It's very Shakespearean.
Yeah, in Rome, there is definitely the concept of falling on your sword. You think Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, also committed suicide as well.
So, Napoleon, and I'm not going to accuse him of being a bipolar or anything, but and we've documented how, like, his mental health and mind state had deteriorated. I mean, he's kind of been, let's say, distracted since, like, the War of the Fifth Coalition, and he grew myopic and cloistered himself, and now he's sort of reached his lowest point. So, Jay, how does this guy go from suicide attempt to once again challenging the great powers of Europe?
Well, that's a good question. So, as you mentioned, and as I'm sure everybody knows, because we wouldn't be doing this episode otherwise, he does survive the suicide attempt. And France, in the meanwhile, ends up signing, basically the marshals sign, what's called the Treaty of Fontainebleau. And the Treaty of Fontainebleau, among other things, specifies that Napoleon renounces the right for him and his descendants to rule France and all of his various conquests. However, it also gives him as, I guess you say, how would I put it? It throws him a little bone, I suppose, which is Elba.
So, yeah, this is kind of weird and interesting because Napoleon is a somewhat unique figure. Not since Oliver Cromwell have we had a non-monarch dictator of this caliber in Europe, and obviously his caliber is far beyond Cromwell's achievements. But I think Cromwell is like the closest figure I can think of, at least from my cursory knowledge of European history up to this point.
I would agree with that.
So, can you just give us some like context? Him being exiled to Elba, is this like a normal thing to happen? Like, how was Elba chosen? Were there fears that if they... Because just to explain, Napoleon's had been carrying that poison around for 2 years, and it wasn't very good anymore. So that's why he didn't die.
Yeah.
Were they fears that they just couldn't kill him for political reasons? Were they trying to, like, give him some dignity? And second off, like, okay, is Elba some prison island, like, from some anime designed to hold the most dangerous people in Europe? Who is holding him in Elba as prisoner? Is he going to be like a prisoner of the British or the Austrians or the Russians or some like proto League of Nations coalition force? Like, how exactly is this working?
Yeah, so those are good questions. I guess just to kind of go through them. In terms of, comparisons to what might have been done, what would have been expected for a defeated monarch like Napoleon. Now, I mean, usually defeated monarchs, you lose a 7 Years' War, you lose 9 Years' War, whatever, you still keep your throne. You just exchange some land, and that's that. Now,
these guys rarely execute each other.
Yes.
Because they kind of know, class conscious-wise, that that's just not best for everybody.
Now, like you mentioned, Napoleon's a bit of an exception. He comes from very obscure nobility, more or less basically commoner. He's seen as a usurper. So one might expect that he might be punished more harshly. And indeed, he is essentially with exile. Exile wasn't a totally uncommon punishment in European wars. Oftentimes when you have like secession disputes and you have two people claiming the throne and one wins, a lot of times the other will just be exiled and given the opportunity to basically go live in a cushy country estate in some neighboring country.
This happens in English history a good bit.
Yes, quite a bit. So that could have been an expectation of that might be what happens to Napoleon. They might say like, okay, you're going to go live in a country estate in England or in Austria, basically under house arrest. That being said, killing him, just outright executing him, I don't think was really on the cards. They weren't really considering it. Even though they did kind of see him as a usurper, he is very popular still with many people. I think they don't want to make him into a martyr. And like you said, it just wasn't done. Like Napoleon, sure, he might have been a usurper, but by this point, he's been the monarch of France for a considerable amount of time. He was crowned by the Pope, even.
Listeners who have followed us throughout all of these episodes will know that the Blücher stocks have never been lower. Blücher is fuming.
Yeah.
Foaming at the mouth, even. I'm just imagining him just being like, just let me at him!
Yeah, so...
Give me 5 minutes!
Yeah, besides Field Marshal Blücher, most people aren't being like, we gotta kill Napoleon. And one of the most important people in these negotiations is Tsar Alexander, who we've mentioned a bunch in the past few episodes. And Tsar Alexander himself was known for his mood swings. And like on the
spurned ex-boyfriend, Tsar Alexander.
During the War of the Six Coalition, he sees himself as like the savior of Christianity and like Napoleon's like evil. But after he wins, I guess this kind of relates to the whole like Christianity aspect, is after the Tsar wins, he suddenly wants to be very merciful and very gracious towards Napoleon. He's like, okay, we've won. We've beat him fair and square. I don't want to rub it in his face as much as some of the other countries want to do.
He is overwhelmed by the shattering joy of the rare Eastern Orthodox dub.
Yeah. Yeah. So There are some diplomats in the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is basically, it's all these countries coming together to decide what they're going to do with Europe. There are some diplomats there who want to send Napoleon somewhere far away. They consider the Cape Colony, so basically South Africa. They consider St. Helena, which is in the South Atlantic. It's a British possession. Like Australia is considered. Yeah, they just want to get him really far away. But the Tsar is like, that's going to be a bit harsh. Like, we don't want to, that's a bit mean. Let him be in Europe. Let him, remain kind of close to France and give him something of a dignified exile. And that's kind of how they settle on the island of Elba. Elba was not a prison. This is not Alcatraz or anything. Elba is a relatively small island off the coast of Italy. It had been owned by France since the War of the First Coalition, basically. And so basically what the Tsar says is, and what the other European powers agree to is, Elba will be given to Napoleon. He will be the Prince of Elba. He will get to make the decisions on that island, and he will get to rule it until he passes away, basically.
Now, Elba, as we said, it's been owned by France since essentially the War of the First Coalition. And so he is still a French subject. You could kind of think of him as the governor of this island. Where are his family and his son? Are they staying with him, or are they going to become Austrians now?
So his wife, Marie Louise, and his son, the King of Rome, Napoleon II, are basically under, I wouldn't even call it house arrest because they're allowed to roam around, but they're basically being held in Vienna by his father-in-law, who is the Emperor of Austria. And the Austrians have no intention of letting them reunite with Napoleon. They don't say so explicitly. They're not banned from seeing Napoleon, but they will stop replying to Napoleon's letters shortly after the beginning of 1815, I believe. And yeah, they're basically being kept separate from him. The rest of his family is allowed to visit him on Elba. His brothers could. They don't, but they technically could have. As for what they're up to, yeah, part of the Treaty of Fontainebleau is that all the various members of the Bonaparte family, they have to renounce all these territories that they've conquered, but they still get to keep their titles and they still get to keep their wealth. So these are all.
Wait. Joseph still gets to technically be king of Spain?
Joseph is an interesting case where he's not king of Spain, but like he's afforded in like court society the respect of a king.
Why are these people obsessed with participation trophies? The entitlement is insane.
His various siblings are, chilling around Europe for the most part. They're all generally quite wealthy. Eugène de Beauharnais still has a title from his wife. He had married a German noblewoman, so he has a little title in Germany, and he's in Germany. Marie Louise is technically made the Duchess of Parma, and actually Parma was then to remain in the Bonaparte family, so that Parma would pass down to Napoleon II and so on and so forth. That's also part of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Two members of his family will choose to live with him on Elba. His mother and one of his sisters, Pauline Bonaparte, will live with him in exile. And, as I mentioned, Elba is not a prison. He has his own miniature court basically there. He has around 800 soldiers in total in his personal guard. He even has a small navy of 3 little ships. Guests can come and go to Elba at will, because, this is an island with a population. It was home to around 13,700 people at the time. So it's not like the hour is going to be like nobody can leave Elba. No, people can come and go as they please. And there are the other guests, people who are part of Napoleon's government who will come and see him on Elba and bring him news and stuff like that.
So there's just nothing stopping him from leaving, or?
So there is a British commissioner, a colonel, who is residing on the island as well, basically to keep watch over him. I don't believe there are many British soldiers because, again, Napoleon's a sovereign prince. They don't want to be like, no, this is occupied by the British. So not really any soldiers. There's just a British officer. The Royal Navy and the French Navy is also kind of active in the area. So there are a lot of patrols from Royal Navy, British Navy, and French Navy ships as well. Basically just kind of show that, like, I guess I should also mention at this point that Napoleon technically is not banned from leaving Elba. He is banned from trying to rule France again, but he's not banned from leaving Elba according to the Treaty of Fontainebleau. But the presence of this commissioner and the presence of British and French ships in the area kind of shows that he's really not supposed to leave Elba. They're probably going to be angry if he does. That's kind of left unsaid. But it's not illegal for him to leave the island. He'll actually go on like short journeys to like this nearby island, which is a tiny rock that has a fortress on it. He goes there to improve the fortifications and keep himself busy and stuff like that.
It's interesting that this is simultaneously very elaborate, and also they seem to have not thought this through very well. I guess this is kind of what happens when multiple powers who are all trying to have different sovereignties have to agree on something.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that we understand like what Elba was, little island, got a little less than 14,000 people on it. Napoleon's got 800 troops. This guy, I'm sure after some brooding, Elba seems to kind of be the best thing that's happened to him in 3 years. His health improves dramatically, and in this sort of classic Napoleon sense, he goes into this flurry of activity. He starts reforming the island's tax codes, he builds a new hospital, he directs the repairing of new fortifications. To be clear, he's not doing any of this, he's telling people to do it, but fixing the roads, improving the water supply. One of the British officers tasked to keep watch over Napoleon complained that it was difficult to keep up with his seemingly, quote, perpetual motion. So this guy spends like about a year just sort of like being the ruler of Elba. He seems to have been quite good at it and feeling a sense of purpose and kind of getting his confidence back. So the question is then presented, why does he leave? So there is a confluence of stressors from within and without. So the first major concern for Napoleon was the matter of his finances. The Treaty of Fontainebleau had stipulated that Napoleon was to be paid a stipend by the French government. Now, this stipend was supposed to be funded by Napoleon's private holdings in France. However, this guy named King Louis XVIII refused to send any money to Napoleon. Wait. Jay, who's King Louis XVIII?
That's a good question. Louis XVIII is the brother of Louis XVI, who, if you remember, had his head chopped off all the way back in one of our early episodes on the French Revolution.
I remember Louis XVII is also the now deceased young son of Louis XVI.
Yeah. So Louis XVIII, before he was officially Louis XVIII, had been living in exile, mostly in England, throughout all these fun coalition wars. And at the end of the War of the Sixth Coalition, when it's clear that the Allies are going to win, they have to decide who's going to rule France now. They're not going to let Napoleon do it, obviously.
They're not going to give it to the King of Rome.
Yeah. There was some thought that they might have a regency for the King of Rome, but they decided against that. It's not going to be republic because we can't have that.
Should have been Eugene. It should have been Eugene.
It really should.
Foolishness.
But eventually, Bernadotte, the former marshal and king of Sweden, wanted it for himself, but
always be hustling.
Yeah, the rest of the European countries were not in favor of that. So
okay, wait, did Bernadotte want it, or did Bernadotte's wife want it?
Both. yeah, this is both.
Because reminder, he's like, we're gonna be the king and queen of Sweden. She's like, do we have to be?
She's like worried that like they're gonna be like bears in Stockholm just eating people. Yeah, it's Louis XVIII, restoring the Bourbon monarchy is eventually settled upon because it's the least bad option that they can all agree on. And the other European countries don't really like Louis XVIII all that much. We kind of went into a bit of like the relationship between the Bourbons and Europe in our early episodes on these wars, but like, just for context, the common conception people have is that like, oh, Europe hated that the Bourbons were kicked out and killed, and they just really wanted to restore the Bourbons. And that's not really true. They viewed the Bourbon monarchy as a bit of a failure for obvious reasons, and they are worried that Louis XVIII is going to be like a failure, and the revolution is just going to start again.
Has to have, like, he's got to be in his 50s at this point, right?
Yeah.
Like, he can't be a particularly personally impressive figure.
Yeah, but he is the least bad option, so he gets to be king again. Well, not again. He wasn't king beforehand.
Now, just super fast, did they, like, try to bring back, like, the Estates General? And actually, wait. We're probably getting a little bit ahead of ourselves.
We'll kind of get into that.
So, long story short, the new king of France refuses to send money to Napoleon, and Elba is exactly rich, and, he's got this big old court with like 800 soldiers, so now he can't really sustain that. There's also the matter of Napoleon's own safety, which is largely stemming as a result of the political developments in France. So we already talked about Louis XVIII. The Bourbons have gloriously returned after over 20 years away, and it does not get off to a good start, does it, Jay?
No, it does not.
But, I mean, okay. Louis XVIII has had like 25 years to like shadow box and think about how he's going to take his country back. Surely he's going to win over the people and solidify popular reforms while making sure that his own base of power is secure. And like, I mean, he's going to hit that shit like Hillary Clinton was going to do it. Like he was going to be like day one, executive orders. Like, surely.
Not exactly. So he kind of is, I guess to go with the start, like just how is he ruling? He's basically forced by the coalition to accept a constitution. Because coalition powers, again, even though they're not necessarily ideologically like big fans of constitutional monarchy, except for maybe the British, but they don't want the French Revolution to start over again. So they're like, you got to accept the liberal constitution or else like we're not supporting you. So
that is legitimately interesting that they thought that was necessary at this point.
So he does.
That is a legitimate concession by the ruling class.
Yeah. So he does accept a liberal constitution, and it's not a terrible constitution. I mean, it's basically what a lot of liberals in France would have wanted, but kind of complicating things is the fact that like Louis XVIII as an actual ruler is really just bad at PR. Like that's my ultimate analysis of the situation from looking into him, is most of the actual decisions he makes aren't terrible. We can say not paying Napoleon his stipend was a pretty bad decision. But apart from that, like, he's not making the worst decisions. He's just bad at publicity. So, if we're going on appearances, which do matter as much as people think that they might or don't want them to, Louis XVIII is best known probably for being morbidly obese.
And this is before, like, processed foods and Arby's existed. Like, you had to work.
Yeah. He
for that at this point in history.
He's barely capable of, like, walking by himself. He's usually has to be, like, pushed around in a wheelchair. And in a country where food scarcity is still common, that's not exactly the best look. Much like his brother Louis XVI, Louis XVIII also has no real talent for public speaking and doesn't really ever attempt it all that much either. He basically just remains a very isolated figure. He's ensconced in the Tuileries, surrounded by a bunch of aristocratic courtiers who themselves are as remote as the king. This is not somebody who's going out and speaking with the people. Now, the presence of these aristocrats is a cause for further alarm amongst the wider population. These are all like hardline royalist emigres who had lost all their land in France during the Revolution, and they want it back now. So, like, there's a lot of talk about, like, seizing land to return to these aristocrats, which, as you can tell, is not very popular. This is land which has been owned by other people for now, like, 20 years. And the church is also obviously pushing for the same thing. They want to return to their property and their prominent place in society.
So just as a reminder, you could be forgiven for listening to our series on the Napoleonic Wars and the Revolution and assuming that, like, the most important thing to come out of the Revolution was the reform of France's military because, help them win all those wars. But, like, the Bourbons being gone, that was interesting. But, like, for my money, the really, really radical part of the revolution was the redistribution of lands, the seizure of church lands, and eventually of noble lands. And now they're wanting all of that economic stuff back. So what's that gonna do to the economy, Jay?
Not good things. The French economy was very dire. For the most part, this is, just the fact that France has been at war with decades, not very good for that. Unemployment is high, economic discontent is high. The king, for budgetary reasons, has to dismiss a lot of soldiers and put a lot of them on half pay. That's also not going to improve things very much. So the economy.
Question.
Yeah.
Does the Allies impose any, like, indemnity on France? Is that kind of like a thing at this point in history?
They do not impose any reparations on France.
So the French economy was just destroyed by, like, the sort of economic upheavals that we just mentioned, and also, like, the wars. Just, so a lot of young men are dead. Things are just fucking in shambles.
Yeah. And, like, to be fair to Louis, most of the economic problems he is inheriting from Napoleon. Now, he explicitly wanted to be king, so it's like, I'm not going to cut him that much credit. He wanted to be in charge of this, but he is inheriting a pretty bad economy from Napoleon. So, for many in France, in 1814 into early 1815, it seems as if all the gains of the revolution had been lost. After decades of struggle, they were seemingly back at square one, being ruled by a distant, aloof government made up of uncaring aristocrats who sought only to better themselves as the economy suffered. Even the beloved tricolor flag had disappeared from official use, being replaced by the old white royal standard. Now, in reality, it would be a mistake to view the new government as exactly the same as that of the pre-revolutionary Ancien regime. As we mentioned, there is a constitution. Also, most of the bureaucracy and the military are actually carried over pretty much entirely intact from Napoleon's empire. Still, this doesn't stop unrest from growing throughout society.
Another quick question. Is there, like, any democratic participation in this constitution? Like,
there is a legislature. It is a very it's very restricted in terms of who can vote and who can get into it. Like, there are a lot of property restrictions, but there is a legislature, yes.
Very, very United States of America at this point in
Yeah.
history, ours. So this new government atop this rolled back revolution and a crumbling economy is, of course, very unpopular. And they are fearing that this is going to spark a new revolutionary movement. And it's very logical that that new revolutionary movement might seek to bring Napoleon back from exile. So the royalists come... They start, putting their scheming hats on. What if we try to assassinate Napoleon by launching a raid on Elba, the guise of a Barbary pirate attack? Rumors of these schemes spread widely, and they reached Napoleon himself. Officials in the Congress of Vienna were more restrained, but even they were leaning towards moving Napoleon from Elba to a more remote location, such as the West Indies, the Cape Colony, or St. Helena. If the situation in France caused Napoleon to be concerned for his own safety, it also offered the prospect of renewed fortunes. Visitors to Elba described how the nation seemed ready to rise up against the government that had been opposed on them by foreign armies, and that it would welcome Napoleon back to defend their liberties. Of course, there were other options potentially available to Napoleon besides a return to France. He could go to Naples, where his brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, still ruled as king. And, he could always go to exile in the United States. But this is Napoleon. This is a gambler. This is a daring man. And there were many who believed that Napoleon was always destined to try his hand at a comeback. While Elba was not a prison, it was small. Far too small to satisfy Napoleon's ambitions. There's only so much to do on Elba. Simply put, it was stifling. And for a man who used to manage an entire empire the size of half a continent to content himself with local infrastructure projects is almost a parody. And while his family members could, in theory, join him on Elba, his wife and his beloved son remained under the control of his father-in-law in Vienna, in the clutches of the hated Austrians that had humiliated him. Whatever his true motivations might have been, by February of 1815, that's 10 months, folks, Napoleon had made his decision. He would return to France in one of the great gambles to reclaim his position as Emperor of France. By the way, folks, I just read the next line of the script, and you are really going to enjoy what Jay's about to tell you. So how does he get out, Jay? What's the big escape of that? What's the Ocean's 11?
Escape.
Is there gonna be like is he gonna like dig a big tunnel? Is there gonna be like a trapeze artist who's gonna have to rappel down over like a crowd? Are they gonna have to launch like a big distraction, like a sort of like parade or festival, and he's gonna be like ferried out under the shadow of night? Are they gonna pull like a House of Dragon and like, fake his death? How do they pull one over on the British Empire?
Yeah, so basically, they just kind of wait until February the 26th of 1815, and that happens to have been when the British commissioner decided to leave Elba. He goes over to mainland Italy.
Does he have like a big is this like a conference or like a big diplomatic mission or like negotiating something? Or
no, he's kind of just meeting with his mistress.
I mean, historically speaking, why else has anyone gone to Italy?
So he's away and
never change, British Empire. Never change, random middle-aged men. Never change.
And this gives Napoleon the opportunity to give him the slip and basically just sail away.
He just left.
As we mentioned, Napoleon has a small navy. He has a brig and 2 sloops.
They gave him the navy.
Yeah. He gets aboard the brig. They load up all his soldiers, his guard and everything. And they sail away, flying the flag of Elba. and posing as merchants. They basically go completely unnoticed by any patrols. A French Navy ship does spot them, but doesn't identify them. They just think that they're merchants. And by the 1st of March, Napoleon's little navy has reached the southern coast of France.
So question, who's his, loyalists? Who's, did he do this fully, him and his court alone? Or was there, anybody on France who's, meeting him there?
There were a couple of his supporters who had come from France who basically went from France to Elba as you got to do it. The time's now. It's a good time. People don't like the king. They're going to welcome you back.
But are any of the marshals with him at this point?
No,
or
none of
any of the old legislature.
None of the marshals are with him. These are fairly relatively minor figures from the empire who are doing this. He doesn't have any really major people with him at this moment. His mom was encouraging him. She was also fully on board. It's yeah, you got to go do it.
We love to see it, folks. We love to see parental approval.
Yeah. It's really mostly just Napoleon and his little court. This was not some grand conspiracy throughout the French government or the army or whatever. And actually, some people the later kind of claim it was, all the marshals, whatever, were conspiring to bring him back. There was no evidence for that.
I'm sure at this point, the vast majority of the French government would send him back.
Yeah, there was no grand conspiracy.
So what happens when he gets there?
So, contrary to how it would sometimes be depicted in, propaganda, pamphlets, and prints and everything, Napoleon is not welcomed by vast gatherings of cheering onlookers, upon setting foot in France. Indeed, the immediate reaction to the landing is basically just one of confusion. Locals in the area where Napoleon puts ashore, this is by a small village known as Gulf Juan, didn't really know what to make of this small army that's coming ashore and requisitioning supplies from hapless town officials. There's a story about the mayor is just sitting in his office, and a French general barges in as I need rations for 600 men or whatever, and he doesn't explain anything else. Just I need rations. And when the mayor refuses, then he's well, I've got my army surrounding this city. Not even the city, this village. So, yeah, they don't really know what's going on. Now, a part of that is because Napoleon isn't immediately out in front of his little group of men. He's hanging back for a little while. But eventually, the identity of this landing party is made clear when Napoleon distributes a proclamation to the people and armies of France. This is a long proclamation. We've shortened it here. It's still pretty long. I think it's worth going into, though, because it kind of explains, I think, both what he's thinking and obviously what he wants people to think. And it's a very interesting document, I find, and we can kind of talk about it as we go through it.
So I'm going to read part of Napoleon's proclamation. Frenchmen, the defection of the Duke of Castiglione delivered Lyon without defense to our enemies. Our victories, the insurrections of the brave peasants, the positions which I had taken at the rear of the hostile army had placed it in a desperate position. Frenchmen were never at the point of being more powerful, and the flower of the hostile army was lost beyond recovery. It would have found its grave in those vast countries which it had so piteously plundered. But that the treason of the Duke of Ragusa gave up the capital and disorganized the army. The unexpected conduct of those two generals, who betrayed at one and the same time their fatherland, their prince, and their benefactor, changed the destiny of the war. So, Jay, who is he talking about? Who's the Duke of Castiglione and who's the Duke of Ragusa?
So the Duke of Castiglione is Marshal Anjou, and the Duke of Ragusa is Marshal Marmont. And this is a really interesting, few paragraphs, because this is how Napoleon starts the proclamation. It's like, what's he talking about? He is talking about the end of the War of the Sixth Coalition. As a refresher,
Yes.
the foreign armies have entered France. Napoleon is fighting them one by one in what we call the 6 Days Campaign. Napoleon's winning a lot of these little tactical victories, but he can't stop the overall tide. But what Napoleon is arguing here is that he had basically the
He
enemies
was stabbed in the back.
Yes, reminds me of nothing more so than the Germans stabbed in the back myth from World War One. Napoleon saying, we've lured the enemies into France. They had overextended their supply lines. I was ready to strike, and they would have lost if it wasn't for the treason of Marshal Anjou and Marshal Marmont, surrendering their armies to the Allies. And this is basically like his way of rationalizing the defeat.
Yeah, and he says, like, the flower of the hostile army was lost beyond recovery. It would have found its grave. He's been like, I totally would have won, guys, if you give me, 2 more days. I swearsies.
Yeah.
So Napoleon continues. Under these new and difficult circumstances, my heart was torn, but my soul remained steadfast. I only thought of the interest of the fatherland. I exiled myself upon a rock in the midst of the sea. My life was and must still be useful to you. Raised to the throne by your choice, everything that has been done without you is illegitimate. During the last 25 years, France has acquired new interests, new institutions, and a new glory, which can only be guaranteed by a national government and by a dynasty born under these new circumstances. A prince who should reign over you, who should be seated upon my throne by the power of the very armies who have devastated our territory, would seek in vain to support himself by the principles of feudal right. And he could only assure the honor and rights of a small number of individuals, enemies of the people, who for 25 years past have condemned them in our national assemblies. Your peace and your foreign prestige would be forever lost. So, Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's basically saying, I am the sole embodiment of the revolution.
Yeah.
Of you, the French people, and if I am not in power, you are not in power. And my enemies are your enemies, is what he's saying.
That's exactly right. He's attacking the Bourbon regime. This is a dynasty imposed by the foreign armies that is seeking a return to feudalism, basically. And yeah, he's saying that, my dynasty, the Bonapartes, is a dynasty born of the revolution. Napoleon always has kind of an interesting relationship with the revolution. That famously at some points in time he says, I am the revolution, and at other points in time he says the revolution is over. But yeah, how you phrased it is what Napoleon is arguing, that he is the embodiment of the French Revolution.
All right, and Napoleon concludes, Frenchmen, in my exile I have heard your complaints and your desires. You were claiming that government of your choice, which alone is legitimate. I have crossed the seas in the midst of perils of every sort. I thrive among you in order to reclaim my rights, which are yours. Everything which individuals have done, written, or said since the taking of Paris, I will forever ignore. It is therefore to you alone, and the brave men of the army, that I consider, and shall always consider it glorious, to owe everything. As an untrained writer, that's not bad.
I do love the cross the seas in the midst of perils of every sort. When, as we explained, he just kind of sailed directly there without incident.
I mean, I also love the earlier there's this slide where he says, I exiled myself upon a rock in the midst of the sea.
Yeah.
It was my choice. I'm not owned. I'm not owned.
Yeah. But yeah, that conclusion is pretty straightforward. It's worth noting, he says, I'll forget everything people have said and done since, the fall of Paris. It's basically saying, like, I'm not going to punish anybody who went over to support the Bourbons. Because obviously, if he immediately starts, chomping off heads, then the country's going to be a lot harder to win over.
That makes him smarter than a lot of people we've covered on this podcast.
Yeah.
If he actually does that.
Yeah. He will, yeah. So the popular image of Napoleon's return to France is going to be one of him riding boldly through town centers, the streets lined with crowds. In reality, at least at the start of this journey, which will end up in Paris, Napoleon is going to purposely avoid big population centers because he's afraid of resistance from the army and from the people. Southern France is a hotbed of royalist sentiments. It had been since the Revolution. And that's, playing a large part in motivating his decision-making. And it means that rather than head towards the large cities of Nice and Marseille, which he would usually kind of go to from where he lands, he would usually go to one of those, and then you would go up on one of the major roads leading up to Paris. He's instead going to go on a more obscure route directly north of where he lands, which is going to take his men through narrow, treacherous mountain roads towards the Alpine city of Grenoble. This is a very difficult route, but it's also a route that's going to be lightly defended. It's dotted mostly by small, unguarded towns and villages, and there's not going to be this danger of like a big royalist resistance to him. Indeed, most of these villages are basically all going to surrender without, any resistance at all. So news of Napoleon's landing does reach Paris pretty quickly, thanks to the country's pretty extensive semaphore system.
If you don't know, semaphore is a type of signaling where you use flags, and, like, each movement of the flags corresponds to a letter of the alphabet, or there's also, like, more vague symbols for more direct communication of basic concepts. Yeah. And you have like a series of towers and people just flag at each other.
Yeah. And France had really pioneered like having an extensive semaphore system during the Revolution. But yeah, so both the court and the press initially dismiss it as a fool's errand. What could Napoleon hope to achieve with just around 1,000 men? This 1,000 is taking into account both his guard and, all his various, like, servants and assistants and the sailors and stuff like that. It amounts to around 1,000 people.
It's really wild that these guys are not concerned about this, considering that they were considering having him assassinated, like, 4 months ago.
Yeah.
No one is competent, folks.
Yeah, so their reasoning is kind of logical. You can't conquer France with 1,000 people. But that's based on a misplaced estimation on the army's loyalty to their king.
Their king who has been in power for 11 months.
Yeah, and a worrying sign of the nature of this loyalty was found in Lyon, where the Comte d'Artois, so that's one of the brothers of the king, is giving a speech to the soldiers and extolling them to put an end to Napoleon's criminal project. And when he ends with like what's going to be basically starting the cheer of "Long Live the King," none of the soldiers cheer. And the generals are going to be similarly muted in their support for the Bourbons. A couple of them will try to rally forces against Napoleon, but they're going to be met with reluctance on the part of their subordinates. A lot of the others just remain still. For example, the largest force of men in the region of the landing was the French army in Marseille under the command of Marshal André Massena. Now, rather than move to stop Napoleon, which he might have been able to do, Massena purposely dithers. He's basically just waiting to see who comes out on top. He'll later claim that, I only received news of the landing, several days after he actually found out about it. So he's not helping Napoleon per se, but he's not helping the king either.
And we got to remember that this is the same army not wanting to go against Napoleon, who has had their pay slashed and a lot of them turned out of the ranks.
Yeah. Yes. Now, perhaps the most famous episode in this march to Paris takes place on the 7th of March in the town of Laffrey, just south of Grenoble. Now here, Napoleon's small column is confronted by a battalion of men from the 5th Infantry Regiment, which had been sent from Grenoble to stop him. Napoleon famously rode up to their lines, dismounted his horse, and with their muskets aimed at him, proclaimed, "Soldiers of the 5th Infantry Regiment, I am your emperor. If there is any soldier among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." After a brief moment of tension, nearly the entire battalion broke ranks and came over to Napoleon's side. This is just one dramatic example of the many units that were starting to go over to Napoleon's side, swelling his ranks.
I'm starting to understand why everybody wrote books about this guy. He certainly acted like he was the protagonist.
Yes.
So on the 10th, Napoleon marches on the second largest city in France, the city of Lyon. We just mentioned that the Comte d'Artois was there. He has deserted it before Napoleon even got there. Napoleon enters, and while he's entering, the king is divering. He's still receiving overly optimistic reports from his advisors, telling him that Napoleon was soon to be defeated. And it was clear to many around him that the situation is slowly spiraling out of control. This is like a classic case of, a fire starts and it's small and it's like, well, who cares? And then suddenly, the table's on fire, the curtains are on fire, and the roof and the whole building is on fire. Because this whole podcast exists because there are certain things in history that just cannot be logically explained without it just. You have to remember, these people are just not very smart. I'm sorry I keep reiterating this point, but I don't know how else to just explain the actions here. They're just not very smart.
It's kind of funny to see some of the stuff that was being said to the king or to the court in Paris at this point. It's basically it's complete Baghdad Bob stuff, where it's he's getting reports saying Napoleon's been defeated outside of Lyon, as Napoleon's been routed and stuff like that. So it's total fiction.
And this is just a great example of Napoleon going up against the old medieval aristocracy and being an actual soldier who could actually lead people and just completely being victorious without even needing to fight. So, a day before the famous encounter at Laffrey, Marshal Michel Ney had been summoned to Paris and been given instructions to lead a force to capture Napoleon. This is the big plan. We're going to have this popular general, famously described by Napoleon as the bravest of the brave, the guy who commanded the rear guard and the retreat to Moscow. This guy is going to stop Napoleon. Ney accepts the command, famously telling the king that he would bring his former emperor back, quote, in an iron cage. Just 10 days later, the court would receive the news that Ney had switched sides, bringing his entire army over to Napoleon. And Ney's defection was the death knell to the Bourbon government. On March the 19th, King Louis XVIII and his remaining followers left Paris for the Belgian border. His midnight flight would be successful, unlike that of his brothers during the early year of the revolution. But in leaving the capital, he was in fact surrendering his country. Napoleon entered Paris the following day, practically being carried to the Tuileries by a jubilant crowd. In less than a month, he had gone from being an exile to reclaiming his crown, all without a single shot fired. A single shot fired by him or towards him. It's wild.
Yeah. And, when I was writing this, I was kind of thinking, in recent memory, we've had two pretty well-known examples of very quick government collapses. Just last year with, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and a few years earlier than that, the Afghan government falling to the Taliban. And in both of those cases, the government's put up more of a fight than Louis XVIII. But I think both of them do show how, like, there are these times where it's like, contrary to whatever numbers exist on paper, how much, how big your army is supposed to be, when the government just like fails to gain any momentum in a fight, in a civil conflict, it just swings from them completely. And at that point, you know it's over. Everybody knows it's over, and there's really nothing that can be done. Armies just surrender left and right, and the game's up.
One thing I kind of wonder about your opinion about is that, like, a lot of these things are sort of generally explained as like popular uprisings and sentiments. Napoleon is carried back by the French people who always loved him and never wanted to abandon him. We know that's not fully the case. It seems to me like he just more like captured the support of key members of the military, a lot of whom were, of course, biased to him in the first place by being his marshals. And did it's kind of like the Russian revolutions, where the people aren't exactly like mass rising for one side. It's just that, like, the people hate the government so much, they're like, I don't know, just go topple them. We don't care. And then they did. And then, the people will be, ooh, Napoleon, woo. But, like, it wasn't so much doesn't look like so much popular sentiment as it looks like him winning over key holders of power in the government.
Yeah, I mean, you could really say that this is a coup d'etat. It is essentially him winning over the army, and that is why he is able to topple the Bourbons. I think that, and we'll kind of go into this a little bit later, it's of the people in France who are energetic, who are actively and politically involved, he is able to mobilize his support and win people over faster than the king is able to, win people over to him, because the king's not really doing anything. At the end of the day, when you have Napoleon who is being bold, who is taking action, who's at the front of an army, and you have a king who's just sitting around doing nothing, like, you know who's going to win.
So, Napoleon's return from Elba has been a massive success. The gamble has paid off. But, like, the French people are really happy. What the heck is going on outside of France? All of the people who are now getting PTSD flashbacks, how are they doing, Jay?
Not great. So yeah, the first thought on the minds of a lot of people during these early days are basically, great, Napoleon's back. Does this mean that we're at war again? Does this mean we're fighting the rest of Europe again? Now, Napoleon, on his part, does espouse his desire for peace all throughout his march on Paris. We mentioned that we read the proclamation he issued on March the 1st, but he's also issuing subsequent proclamations. And in them, he's constantly saying that I just want peace. I'm not trying to conquer Europe. We the French people are not trying to conquer Europe.
He also promised the restoration of glories.
Yeah. Well,
just saying.
You got to play to different audiences. Like in one of them, he's like playing up to veterans, being like how like veterans like now like today, after my fall, you have to be ashamed of your service. But now when I'm restored, you don't have to be ashamed of your service. You can show your scars proudly, and stuff like that. So he's playing up to multiple different audiences. But he is saying that I want peace. We're not going to seek to impose our will on other countries. We just don't want other countries to impose their will, the Bourbon monarchy, on us. And this means that, he also sends out messages to all the capitals of Europe affirming his desire for peace. This isn't as hopeless of a cause as it might seem at first. There is some reason that Napoleon might have thought this could have been successful. The main reason is that the coalition powers, the main ones being Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, are not as unified in 1815 as they had been the previous year. Following the end of the War of the Sixth Coalition, Russia and Prussia had made ambitious territorial claims, seeking the complete annexation of Poland and Saxony respectively, that had really alarmed the British and the Austrians. In fact, the situation was so severe that in January of 1815, Britain, Austria, and France had signed a secret treaty to oppose Russia and Prussia in case of a potential war. Now, unfortunately for Napoleon, any hope he has for peace is going to disappear pretty quickly. The lingering questions over how to divide up Europe meant that the Congress of Vienna was still in session at the time of Napoleon's return. This allowed representatives from the various European powers to coordinate their response to his actions and decide quickly on their course of action. The result was clear. On March the 13th, they declared Napoleon an outlaw for having broken the Treaty of Fontainebleau.
If I was Napoleon, I'd figure like my best chance would be like to cut a deal with one of the members of the coalition, probably Austria, to try and like divide them against the rest. That would be like the best play. But as you said, like he's not able to do that because they're all in Austria talking.
Yeah.
And Metternich is trying to do his, grand dance and
Talleyrand is I was about to mention Talleyrand is also there, and Talleyrand really does not want Napoleon to succeed. So Talleyrand is like going to everybody saying that you got to fight this guy.
Yeah, just for those who aren't aware, Talleyrand, big French diplomat under Napoleon, who has at this point betrayed Napoleon in the War of the Sixth Coalition to negotiate against him, and so now Napoleon's back. He is really freaked out.
Yeah. It also doesn't help things that a few days after the 13th, King Murat of Naples will invade Austria's Italian possessions. Now, just to refresh people, Murat is Napoleon's brother-in-law, and he was also a marshal of the French Empire. In 1814, though, he had switched sides during the War of the Sixth Coalition in order to safeguard his throne. He basically goes to the Allies, says, I'll support you if you keep me on as King of Naples. But he had been hearing largely correct rumors that the Austrians were actually going to invade Naples and depose him. So he decides to launch an attack. This is without having consulted Napoleon. He's doing this on his own motivation, basically. But the Allies think that Murat and Napoleon are working together. They don't believe that they don't know what each other is doing. So when Murat is invading Austrian territory, basically, the Allies are like, okay, this is Napoleon up to his usual games. Napoleon starting up the wars of conquest again. And this affirms their desire to depose Napoleon. And on the 25th of March, they will ratify their alliance, and they will declare war not on France, but on Napoleon himself.
Okay, so we have another alliance, even though this is never referred to as the War of the Seventh Coalition, because whatever. The Allied response to his return meant that Napoleon would now once more be faced with the task of leading his country into war. Unfortunately for him, France was not that strong, and its people were not as uniform in their support of the emperor as they had once been. Napoleon had been warmly received in Paris. His popularity was further boosted by a surge in manufacturing and construction, much of which was military-related, that reduced unemployment. The French people, at least those who were politically active, could be divided into roughly four groups: liberals, royalists, Bonapartists, and Jacobins. The Bonapartists are obviously already on Napoleon's side. Napoleon feared the Jacobins as representing the mob, that chaotic entity that could both save or ruin rulers. So he doesn't really trust them. But he did appoint the prominent Jacobin Lazare Carnot as interior minister. The liberals largely represented the middle and upper classes that had been the leaders of the revolution. They had mostly come to support Napoleon during the Empire, but many had become disillusioned after years of war and economic disruption. Winning them back was seen as crucial because obviously, the conservative royalists Well, I mean, he just kicked their guy out.
Yeah.
So in order to appease these liberals, Napoleon promised to rule in a constitutional manner, eschewing the trappings of absolution that had characterized the French Empire. He ordered the creation of a new constitution, ironically based in large part on the one that had been accepted by Louis XVIII just a year prior, and allowed for free elections to the National Assembly. It was a sign of the mood of the nation, or at least of the educated elites who took part in this election, that the explicitly Bonapartist faction led by Napoleon's younger brother Lucien only won 80 out of the 629 seats on the Chamber of Representatives. The vast majority of the seats instead going to unaffiliated liberals. Remember, there wasn't a lot of what we would call political parties at this point.
Yeah.
Even if you were liberal or conservative or Bonapartist or whatever.
Yeah.
Not only did Napoleon have to deal with a legislature that was not uniformly behind him, but he also had to figure out a way around the government's dire financial straits. Much of the civil administration was forced to go without pay, taxes were raised, always an unpopular move, and further funds were drummed up through voluntary contributions. Napoleon be like, please contribute to my Patreon.
Yes, he is literally crowdfunding the French army.
But as anyone with a Patreon will tell you, it's far from enough to support a new military buildup. To make matters worse for Napoleon's government, royalist uprisings soon broke out in the Vendée and in southern France. The same conservative regions that he avoided earlier, and the same conservative regions that had rebelled against the revolutionary governments all the way back in 1794. While these uprisings were disorganized and not overly dangerous on their own, the need to suppress them and guard against further uprisings deprived the army of soldiers that could otherwise have been used in the upcoming campaign against the Allies.
Now, support for Napoleon was probably strongest in the army. Indeed, as we've kind of covered, his successful return to France can really be seen as a coup d'etat rather than a revolution. Even here, though, there were signs of cracks. Now, most lower officers and NCOs supported Napoleon, but many of the marshals were kind of more lukewarm in their take on the whole situation. Some of them will actually remain loyal to the Bourbons. Say, I swore an oath to the king, I'm supporting the king now. Others will refuse to pick a side and basically just remain in their country estates. They won't accept a role in the army, or they'll only accept minor roles in the military. An example is Marshal Berthier, who had for years served as Napoleon's indispensable chief of staff. He's the guy who's basically translating Napoleon's commands into actionable orders. When he hears that Napoleon's back, he flees France for Germany to avoid getting, caught up in the whole situation. Now, at the time of Napoleon's return, the French army has around 210,000 men on active duty. And by calling up men on leave, this number was increased to around 290,000. Further attempts to increase the size of the army and the National Guard were met with resistance, though, as throughout much of the countryside, men simply refused the call to arms. Local governments often tolerated this resistance. Indeed, Carnot reported that the majority of the country's prefects and mayors were either apathetic towards or opposed to Napoleon. Now, these local government officials could be replaced, but doing that obviously took time. And, on these royalist areas we mentioned, conscription was basically impossible. So conscription's not going to turn out as many men as Napoleon was hoping for.
I mean, how many men has France have left?
Yeah, there's always more. There's always more soldiers for the trenches, I suppose. Yeah, given all the difficulties facing Napoleon, one might naturally, ask why the French, after abandoning him in 1814, welcomed him back in 1815, only to be so lukewarm in their support. I think in reality, while many had feared the outbreak of revolution in France in 1815, the prevailing attitude in the country was actually one of apathy.
Yeah.
Napoleon is able to rally more of those who aren't apathetic than the king is, and that's enough to carry him to Paris. Enough for the army sides with him that the coup is successful. But many of those who are not willing to intervene to save the king are also now not that excited to fight for Napoleon. Anti-Napoleonic sentiment for the time being is not enough to overthrow him. The royalists try, but they're too few in number and too disorganized. The Jacobins are not nearly as potent of a force as they had been before the empire, largely as a result of many years of Napoleonic censorship. And the liberals are mostly content with just kind of waiting to see how things turn out.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. Like, the more I look at history, you have cases like, for example, the Iranian Revolution, where you have a very popular, sweeping government change fueled by the fact that people are riled up. But I think most revolutions happen because of the opposite, because of apathy. You look at the Russian Revolution, like I mentioned before. We've talked about the Cuban Revolution. Similarly, like, this, when you think about it in terms of, like, what people show in movies, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. But when you look in the practicalities of, Napoleon came in because there was a lot of apathy, and now he's having resistance because the apathy is still there. That makes sense. You just have to follow the emotions.
Yeah.
It's very similar to, you already mentioned, like, Afghanistan and Syria. Like, the regimes were hated, but, like, and the other side was feared. But a lot of people were just like, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So faced with all these domestic challenges and an oncoming war, Napoleon was left with two choices. He could assume a defensive posture, waiting for the Allies to invade France for counterattacking, or he could go on the offense. But come on, you know what Napoleon gonna do? The choice was obvious. The longer he waited, the more time the Allies would have to mobilize and gather their armies, and the longer the French economy would suffer under the burden of war. If he could catch the Allies off guard, he could potentially win a quick and decisive victory, like he's done time and time again, that would improve his popularity at home and allow him to open negotiations with the Allies from a position of strength. All is in favor of the offense. Napoleon settled on the latter course of action. Of the four main Allied armies, Napoleon knew that Russia and Austria would be the slowest to mobilize. This, combined with their distance from France, meant that they could be dealt with later. The more immediate threat came from the British and Prussians, who were gathering their armies in Belgium. Napoleon's plan was thus simple in its design: a rapid thrust into the Low Countries to defeat the British and Prussians, preferably in turn. On the 15th of June, 1815, 88 days after his triumphal return in Paris, Napoleon crossed the border into Belgium at the head of an army of 128,000 men. The Waterloo campaign had begun, and we will pick it up next time on No One is Competent, as well as in our ultimate episode of the French series. Look at just everything that has happened, recap a lot of stuff, send this period of history away, and see if we have at all learned anything from this utter mess. Jay, does that sound like a good plan to you?
Yes, it does.
Do we have any, like, final thoughts on this part? I mean, we kind of, this is a No One is Competent podcast. We're always kind of looking for the stupidity and the losers. And I like that we focused on, the Allies who did not try hard enough to keep Napoleon down, and the failure of the Bourbon government. Makes a lot of sense that they aren't really remembered, or at least this part of them isn't really remembered. And, remind me if I'm wrong, but Louis XVIII is not going to get another bite at the apple, right?
No, he will.
He just dies soon after, right? Okay.
Yeah, he's there for a little bit. Then it goes to Charles X, and during Charles X, there is the July Revolution.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. But we're now getting very far
Yeah.
ahead of ourselves. For those unaware of how complicated the French Revolutionary period is, the events of the famous play Les Miserables haven't even occurred yet.
Yeah.
We're still like 15 years away from that shit.
Yeah.
But thank you to the audience for sticking with us throughout all of this. I am Azalea. Jay has been Jay. You can follow us on Twitter at Jaharies48 and at Azalea Wyatt. Please leave some likes, some reviews, some comments, subscribes, however you can interact with the algorithms on whatever you're listening to. We greatly appreciate that. Our music, of course, is done by the legendary Sam Bryce. You can reach out to us at nooneincompetent@gmail.com. Please take care of yourself in the bitter winter of this year. It's gonna be okay, folks, if we make it okay. And I believe in us. See you next time.